Hello. This is going to be a little bit different. Wait a minute in history than I had planned. It has a lot to do with a lot of things I've read over the last week. So I have a whole little show on epidemiology that I plan to do coming up here in the next couple of days. But if you'll indulge me, what I'd like to do is to read a passage from one of my favorite books and a book that I've reread. Don't get too excited about why I'm rereading it at the time. I just want to read this passage and then make a couple of comments about things that I've seen over the last week. I am going to read just a couple of pages from one of my favorite books, World War Z by Max Brooks. That's actually, as an interesting side note, Mel Brooks' son. No kidding, Mel Brooks, comedian, director, funny guy. That's his son, who wrote a really good zombie book. Anyways, for those of you who haven't picked it up or haven't read it, World War Z is an interview-based book having to do with the idea that there was an actual zombie plague which broke out, reanimated the dead, and nearly destroyed the world. So as he's going through their different phases and stages, and now he's talking to somebody who is responsible for communication during the darkest days of the war. And for anybody who wants to follow along or find it later on when you get this book, this is page 194. Ulithi Atoll, Federated States of Micronesia. During World War II, this vast coral atoll served as the main forward base for the United States Pacific Fleet. During World War Z, it sheltered not only American naval vessels, but hundreds of civilian ships as well. One of these ships was the UNS Ural, the first broadcast hub of Radio Free Earth. Now a museum to the achievement of the project, she is the focus of the British documentary Worlds at War. One of the subjects interviewed for this documentary is Bharati Palshagar. Ignorance was the enemy. Lies and superstition, misinformation, disinformation. Sometimes no information at all. Ignorance killed billions of people. Ignorance caused the zombie war. Imagine if we had known then what we know now. Imagine if the undead virus had been understood as, say, tuberculosis was. Imagine if the world's citizens, or at least those charged with protecting those citizens, had known exactly what they were facing. Ignorance is the real enemy, and cold hard fact was the weapon. When I first joined Radio Free Earth, it was still called the International Program for Health and Safety Information. The title Radio Free Earth came from individuals and communities who monitored our broadcasts. It was the first real international venture, barely a few months after the South African plan, which was, as an aside, a plan meant to try and bring the world back from the brink of destruction for the zombie invasion. And years before the conference in Honolulu, just like the rest of the world based their survival strategies on Rediker, which was the South African plan, our genesis was rooted in Radio Obunye. What was Radio Obunye? And throughout the story, the author is just asking questions and letting the interviewee speak. South Africa's broadcast to its isolated citizens. Because they didn't have the resources for material aid, the only assistance the government could tender was information. They were the first, at least to my knowledge, to begin these regular multilingual broadcasts. Not only did they offer practical survival skills, they went so far as to collect and address each and every falsehood circulating among its citizens. What we did take in the template of Radio Obunye was to adapt it for the global community. I came aboard literally at the very beginning, as the Ural's reactors were just being put back online. The Ural was a former vessel of the Soviet, then the Russian, Federal Navy. Back then, the SSV-33 had been many things: a command and control ship, a missile tracking platform, an electronic surveillance vessel. Unfortunately, she was also a white elephant because her systems, they tell me, were too complicated even for her own crew. She had spent the majority of her career tied to a pier in Vladivostok, naval base, providing additional electrical power for the facility. I'm not an engineer, so I don't know how they managed to replace her spent fuel rods or convert her massive communications facilities to interface with global satellite networks. I specialize in languages, specifically those of the Indian subcontinent. Myself and Mr. Verma, just the two of us to cover 1 billion people. Well, at that point it was still 1 billion. Mr. Verma had found me in a refugee camp in Sri Lanka. He was a translator, I was an interpreter. We'd worked together several years before at our country's embassy in London. We thought it had been hard work then. We had no idea. It was a maddening grind, 18, sometimes 20 hours a day. I don't even know when we slept. There was so much raw data, so many dispatches arriving every minute. Much of it had to do with basic survival, how to purify water, create an indoor greenhouse, culture and process mold spore for penicillin. The mind-numbing copy would often be punctuated with facts and terms I had never heard before. I'd never heard, and they go on for several terms throughout the book about zombies and the impact and different things like that. Or the false miracle cure of phalanx. That one's kind of important. All I knew was that suddenly there was a uniformed man shoving a collection of words before my eyes and telling me, we need this in Marathi, ready to record in 15 minutes. So what kind of information were you combating? Where do you want me to begin? Medical, scientific, military, spiritual, psychological? The psychological aspect I found most maddening. People wanted so badly to anthropomorphize the walking blight. In war, conventional war, that is. We spend much time trying to dehumanize the enemy, to create an emotional distance. We would make up stories or derogatory titles. When I think about what my father used to call the Muslims, and now, in this war, it seemed that everyone was trying to desperately to find a shred of connection to their enemy, to put a human face on something that was so unmistakably human. Can you give me some examples? There were so many misconceptions. Zombies were somehow intelligent, they could feel and adapt, use tools, and even use some human weapons. They carried memories of their former existence, or they could be communicated and trained like some sort of pet. It was heartbreaking having to debunk one misguided myth after another. The civilian survival guide helped, but was severely limited. Oh really? How was that? Oh yes, you could see it was clearly written by an American with the references to SUVs and firearms. There was no taking into account the cultural differences, the various indigenous solutions people believed to save them from the undead. Such as, I'd rather not give too many details, not without tacitly condemning the entire people group from which the solution oriented. As an Indian, I had to deal with the many aspects of my own culture that had turned self-destructive. There was Varanasi, one of the oldest cities on earth, near the place where Buddha supposedly preached his first sermon, and where thousands of Hindu pilgrims came each year to die. In normal pre-war conditions, the road would be littered with corpses. Now these corpses were rising to attack. Varanasi was one of the hottest white zones, a nexus of living death. The nexus covered almost the entire length of the Ganges. Its healing powers had been scientifically assessed decades before the war, something to do with the high oxygenation rate of the waters. Tragic. Millions flocked to its shores, serving only to feed the flames, even after the government's withdrawal to the Himalayas. When over 90% of the country was officially overrun, the pilgrimages continued. Every country had a similar story. Every one of our international crew had at least one moment when they were forced to confront an example of suicidal ignorance. An American told us about how the religious sect known as God's Lambs believed that the rapture had finally come, and the quicker that they were infected, the quicker they would go to heaven. Another woman, I won't say what country she belonged to, tried her best to dispel the notion that sexual intercourse with a virgin would cleanse the curse. I don't know how many women or little girls were suffered as a result of this cleansing. Everyone was furious with his own people. Everyone was ashamed. Our Belgian crew member compared it to the darkening skies. He used to call it the evil of our collective soul. I guess I have no right to complain. My life was never in danger. My belly was always full. I might not have slept, but at least I could sleep without fear. And more importantly, I never had to work in the Ural's IR department. IR? Information reception. The data we were broadcasting did not originate aboard the Ural. It came from all around the world, from experts and think tanks in various government safe zones. They would transmit their findings to the IR operators, who in turn would pass it along to us. Much of this data was transmitted to us over conventional open civilian bands, and many of these bands were crammed with ordinary people's cries for help. There were millions of wretched souls scattered throughout our planet, all screaming into their private radio sets as their children starved, or their temporary fortress burned, or the living dead overran their defenses. Even if you didn't understand the language, as many of the operators didn't, there was no mistaking the human voice of anguish. They weren't allowed to answer back either. There wasn't time. All the transmitters had to be devoted to official business. I don't want to know what it was like for the IR operators. When the last broadcast came from Buenos Aires, when that famous Latin singer played the Spanish lullaby, it was too much for one of our operators. He wasn't from Buenos Aires. He wasn't even from South America. He was just an 18-year-old Russian sailor who blew his brains out over his instruments. He was the first, and since the end of the war, the rest of the IR operators have followed suit. None of them is alive today, including my Belgian friend. You carry those voices with you, he told me one morning. We were standing on the deck, looking into that brown haze, waiting for a sunrise we knew we'd never see. Those cries will be with me for the rest of my life, never resting, never fading, never ceasing in their call to join them. Why did I spend so much time reading that little passage? I wanted to point out a little bit of context. I'm not calling our current pandemic a zombie virus. No one is rising from the dead. I'm calling it a global health concern. Last week, just as the passage in the book, disinformation, misinformation, wrong information, misguided proclamations of blame from multiple sources, including elected officials and semi-official people working in a semi-official capacity. I lost count of how many different pieces of unverified information I saw flying around. And here's the deal. I get it. We need to process this. And, as an American personally, we are not good at sitting still. We want to get out and we want to do something. We want to get to the bottom of it. We want to figure out what's going on. I lived in an area that was heavily hit by Hurricane Harvey just about 3 years ago, and the clouds weren't even out of the skies before people flooded into the streets looking for something to do. And now we can't do that, or it's irresponsible to do so. So you have this tool in front of you. You want to make a discovery, and then you want to share it, right? But without checking whether or not it's well sourced, well informed, we want to make sure that this isn't going to be something that's going to lead to an unfortunate consequence for someone else who trusts that information because it came from you. And we all interact with it differently. We're all trying to find a different type of solution. I've seen quite a few people who want to look for someone to blame. Hammering in on stories about Chinese disinformation in the early parts of the pandemic, or hammering in one political party or another who's not being honest. There are quite a few people who want to talk about economics, which, yes, that's a real thing to talk about. And I think eventually, hopefully, it will lead to some sort of conversation about everyone we are relying on and depending upon right now are also the people who are generally told, well, if you don't like where you're at, you should get a better job. So it's a little ironic that in a broken economic system and coming from broken employees who then have, broken apartment managers, and, then there are banks who are probably not making any money either. And then there are who gets a bailout, who doesn't. That's a really good conversation. But until we know how that works, what kind of information is out there? There are some people who are going to establish the essential oils route. I'm going to make all my own home remedies and I'm going to make it work. And I've seen multiple times where people have to post, don't make your own home cleaners because you're going to turn it into chlorine gas and kill yourself. How much time and how much information do people have to spend, officials working on trying to combat this particular plague? How much time do they have to spend debunking erroneous information? And how much time could we give people if we didn't do that? If we checked where it came from before we did? Just to look at it this way, I find something, it's incriminating, it responds to my own personal bias, I throw it out there. Other people who trust me as a reasonably intelligent guy take it on faith. It gets somebody, not them, but somebody in their circle sick. That person is sick enough to go to the hospital. They go in and check into an already overwhelmed hospital system where nurses are, trying to find every single way to reinvigorate their expired N95 masks. I've heard of, nurses saying, well, we're going to try and put them in a toaster oven and heat them up. Maybe that'll help us make them last a little bit longer. That's a real story. Every single time we share something that we don't know about, that may not be true, that's not focused on the idea of we all need to flatten this out and stay away from each other until it abates, for the help of those who are going to be compromised medically, for the help of the overwhelmed already medical community. How many pointless debates on blame and function and spread are we going to have fixed by some health expert because we shared it without thinking? And so, civilization largely began because we decided we couldn't do it as one family unit anymore. And so I would ask, as you look at what you're posting, are you adding to the idea that civilization is something that was a really good step forward, or are you adding to the argument of some anthropologists that after we were stopped being hunter-gatherers, it was really the beginning of the end? All of that to say, please think about what you're posting and find out where it comes from. And is it going to help people, all of us, to try and flatten this curve and to move forward? and to keep people healthy, and to keep those who aren't healthy from becoming even sicker, from overwhelming the hospital system, or dying as a result of it. I appreciate you listening to me, appreciate your indulgence. I will be back with something maybe a little lighter hearted later in the week. But for now, thank you for watching. Wait a Minute in History.